Okay, so today what we're going to be talking about is kind of a continuation of where we left off yesterday. We were talking about experimental design. We were talking about how to test hypotheses. And something that we mentioned while we were doing that is that when you are performing an experiment, you are going to collect information from that experiment. We call that information data. So today we're going to be talking about the ways that we organize and analyze that data. Okay? It's important that when we are doing an experiment that we are gathering information from that experiment, but that information may not be very clear just from the gathering. So this is where scientists are going to take the data once we're done, and we're going to try to make sense of it. And it usually starts by organizing that data first. Okay? And a lot of this should be somewhat familiar because you've kind of seen these practices before. It's just we need to make sure that we understand them as they are used in science, because this will be something that will be on your EOC. On the end of course exam, you will see charts and graphs, and you'll be given data from experiments and be asked to explain what's going on. So this is the same priority standard that we've seen before: to use concepts to solve scientific problems using the scientific method and elements of scientific inquiry. We've already talked about those. And draw conclusions to scientific problems from qualitative and quantitative data. So the qualitative and quantitative data part, that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So when we are doing a scientific investigation, as I've said, you're going to be collecting information from that investigation. Whether you're doing scientific inquiry or more likely scientific method, you're going to be gathering information from that process. And that information is what we call data. Okay? And yes, we could pronounce that data or data. Either way is correct. I kind of go back and forth on those. But your data is what you're then going to use to either support your hypothesis or refute your hypothesis. So if your data seems to show that your hypothesis was correct, then that supports your hypothesis. If your data seems to show that your hypothesis was incorrect, then that refutes your hypothesis. Now, scientists always say it in terms of support and refute because, as we've said, scientists can't be 100% certain on things. They might be like 99.999% certain, but they always want to leave that window open. So the data simply tells us, yeah, we're on the right track, or no, we're not on the right track. We don't want to say, yeah, this one experiment just proves everything or disproves everything. Okay. Something that I meant to talk about in the last section is something that's important to kind of think about when it comes to experimentation. There'll be times when I'll have students in class doing a lab activity, and they'll get kind of upset because the lab didn't work right, and it didn't give them the results they expected to get. Failure is a big part of science. Okay? Scientists actually fail far more often than they succeed. This is the reason why when successes do happen in science, it makes the news. Because you could have a scientist working for years and years and years and not finding success. Okay? And that's part of the process, is for every failure, you're kind of eliminating possibilities. So if I test a hypothesis and nope, that's not it, we eliminate that possibility and we try a new one. Okay? So every time a scientist has a failure, it's not seen as like, oh, I did the science wrong. It's seen as that's one step along the process. Okay? Think about it. Say you have a cookie jar and you have 10 kindergartners and the cookie jar is empty. And you're like, okay, who ate all the cookies? Okay. Well, if you can eliminate possible suspects, it's like, okay, that person there has a gluten allergy. They're not going to steal the cookies. That person over there, that one's a hyperactive kid, and if he had any sugar in his body, he wouldn't be sitting still, so that can't be the culprit. So the more possibilities you remove, the closer and closer you get to the correct answer. So when scientists fail at an experiment, or if a hypothesis is refuted, it's proven to be wrong, that's just seen as a step towards finding the truth. Okay? And that's what data helps us do. When we collect data from an experiment, this is the evidence that starts pointing us closer and closer to the right direction. And there are two specific kinds of data that we can collect from an investigation. And which kind of data we collect really depends on the type of experiment we're doing and the information that you can gather from that particular experiment. So first of all, we have information that can be basically put into words. These are descriptive terms. This is what we call qualitative data. Okay? Think of the word quality. If you can describe the quality of something, then that's qualitative data. So scientifically speaking, things like color, shape, texture, odor, these would be things that you could collect qualitatively. If I'm growing flowers, like the example I used yesterday, okay, you can use the qualitative description of the flowers are green, or you can say the flowers look healthy. So these things are descriptive in nature. Okay. Now, something you got to be careful of, qualitative data does not incorporate your feelings about the data. So you would never include, oh, things seem to be going well as part of qualitative data, okay, because that's your opinion on things. And scientists try to remove themselves and their feelings and their kind of preconceptions from science as much as possible. Now, we're all human, so it happens from time to time where a scientist will get really excited about an idea, and they're convinced this is it, this is how it's going to work. And that might influence their interpretations of the results. But they try to remove themselves as much as possible because we don't want our feelings to get in the way of the data. Scientists want their knowledge to be driven by the evidence and nothing else. And again, sometimes that can be hard, but that's the goal. So qualitative data is any time that you're using descriptive terms. The other kind of data that you can collect is what is called quantitative data. Quantitative data is where you're taking numerical measurements. Think about the word quantity. Okay, so if you have a quantity of something, it's the number of something. In most scientific investigations, quantitative data is kind of the preferred type of data because numbers don't lie. If I measure the height of a plant and that plant is 10 centimeters tall, you really can't argue with that measurement. Now, we could argue that you measured it wrong or that your ruler is broken or something like that, but if you have an accurate measurement, you can't really argue with the numbers. Qualitative descriptions, you can kind of argue those descriptions. Like someone could say, oh, that plant is dark green. And someone else could say, oh, no, it's more of a medium colored green. Well, we could argue about what's the difference between medium green and dark green and things like that. But if I say that plant is 10 centimeters tall, you can't say, nope, it's 20 centimeters tall. Well, no, I can take a ruler and I can show you what the right answer. The other reason why quantitative data is valuable is because we can take that data and throw it into some mathematical calculations. I always get complaints from students like, why are we doing math? This is science, not math class. Okay, well, science and math are intricately connected, and a lot of times the numbers we collect from an experiment don't really mean much until we use those numbers to calculate the results. And we're actually going to see that in the lab we're going to be working on Thursday. Okay. So anything that you can measure, mass, length, volume, these are quantitative values. Time is another important one. Now, once you've collected your data, it becomes important to try to organize that data. So regardless of what kind of data you have, you want to be able to organize it in a way that makes it easy to interpret. Because during the procedure of the experiment, you may not necessarily be thinking of, what does this data mean for me? Okay, you might just be involved in making sure that the experiment is going on properly, and you're just writing down the information as it comes at you. And this is pretty common in a scientific investigation, is that we're just collecting data as we go. Okay? And once we're done collecting that data, we can then say, okay, what does that data actually mean for us? So one of the most basic ways to organize data is by putting it into a data table. Okay? Data tables are good for both qualitative and quantitative data. Okay. Qualitative data is a little bit easier to organize in a data table than it is in other kinds of visual representations. Okay. Data tables are organized in columns and rows. If you're familiar with spreadsheets at all, like Excel or in Max, it's numbers. Okay. If you're familiar with that, you have vertical columns and you have horizontal rows. Where the column and the row intersects, that's going to be what we typically call a cell. And that cell is where you place the information for your experiment. Here's a simple example of a data table containing qualitative data. So this is descriptive more than it is numerical. So something to keep in mind, whenever we organize our information into any sort of table or graph, we need to have a title. Okay, the title is important because that helps us describe what's going on inside this representation. What are we looking at here? Okay, if I ask you to give a data table a title, please don't give it the title table, because that doesn't tell me anything about what's going on in that table. You can't assume that people know what the information is that we're staring at. So the title needs to be descriptive for that data table or for that graph. So here we have United States capitals. So we know that we're dealing with states in the United States and their capitals. So we have 4 columns here: your state flag, your capital name, your state name, and your time zone. And then each horizontal row is giving us information from a specific state. So if we wanted to know, say, the capital of Arizona, you find the column for capital and then the row for Arizona, and where that intersects, you find Phoenix, Arizona, which of course is the capital. Okay. And we can list all sorts of information. Here we have even pictures of their state flags. So in a data table, you don't necessarily have to have numbers or descriptions. We can actually have diagrams as well. Okay. Here's another example of a data table. This one incorporates both quantitative and qualitative data. So we're looking at participants in some sort of survey or something. So we have age, which that is a numerical value, so that's quantitative data. And then you have gender and place of origin. That's more descriptive, so that's going to be qualitative data. When we're interpreting quantitative data, that is data in numbers, okay, the easiest way to represent those measurements is in the form of a graph. Now, graphs are useful because graphs allow us to see the patterns in the numbers. Okay? A list of numbers, like on a data table, doesn't always make sense. Our brains are not really designed to interpret numbers in that way. But something that our brains, human brains, are really good at is finding patterns in pictures. In fact, our brains are just really good at finding patterns in general. Okay? And this is evident if you ever look up at a cloud and say, "Ooh, look, a bunny." Okay, well, when you look up at the clouds, you're not actually seeing a bunny. What you're seeing is a random shape that happens to be similar to what somebody might be able to interpret as a bunny. Okay? Our brains look for those patterns because that helps us make sense of the world around us. Okay? And scientists love patterns because patterns are important to helping us predict what happens next. So if we observe a pattern, this really helps us take it to the next step. So let's say you see a squirrel. That squirrel runs up to a tree, climbs the tree, grabs an acorn, goes down the tree, and then runs off into the bushes. Okay, the next day you see that same squirrel show up, run up the tree, grab an acorn, run down, and go into the bushes. So every day you watch this squirrel do this thing. Okay, that becomes a pattern. So you can predict the next day they're going to do the same thing, and the day after that they're going to do the same thing. Okay, so when you have patterns like that, it makes it easier to interpret what's going to happen next. Okay. Now, what happens when that pattern breaks? Okay, so next day, squirrel doesn't show up. Okay, so now something different is going on. So patterns may seem boring, but to scientists, patterns are important. But when those patterns break, that's when the exciting stuff happens. So now you're asking, what's happened to the squirrel? What's going on? Why aren't they collecting more acorns? Well, further investigation might help us understand why that pattern changed from where it was. Okay, so maybe the reason why that squirrel was running up the tree and grabbing acorns and running into the bushes is because it was stocking up on food to hibernate. Okay, so now the weather has changed and it's time to hibernate. So that's why the pattern changed. So patterns on a small scale can help us interpret patterns on a big scale. Because if we look annually at the squirrel's behavior, we're going to see, oh, well, that squirrel does that every year. Collects acorns in the fall, hibernates in the winter. Data being put on a graph helps us better recognize these patterns. And there's different types of graphs that we can use. And this is a mistake that students make all the time, is that they will use the wrong kind of graph for the wrong kind of data. Okay, so each graph, and you're probably familiar with all these different kinds of graphs, each graph has a specific kind of data that it's best used for. Okay. So the first one is what we call a circle graph. Another name for a circle graph is a pie chart, and you've probably seen these before. But specifically, a circle graph is designed to show quantities that are part of a whole. Okay. Meaning that if you can show that this measurement is part of a bigger measurement, then you could use a circle graph to represent that. We call it a pie chart because we can use the slices of the pie to represent a fraction of that whole pie, or a percentage of that whole pie. So if we can interpret a number as a percent of something, then you can represent that in a circle graph. So if I look around the classroom and survey, okay, how many people in this class have blonde hair versus how many people in this class have brown hair versus how many have red hair. Okay, so in this class, there are 18 students. So I can take how many people have each hair color as a percent of the entire class. Okay, so I can represent that in a circle chart. So here's a simple example of a circle graph. And like I said with the data tables, an important part of that any graph is going to be a title. So here we have a title at the top. It says pet ownership. So without knowing anything else about whatever experiment we might have run or what data we might have collected, we have a pretty clear picture of what this chart is trying to tell us. Okay, it's something about the ownership of a pet. The other thing that you'll notice is on the right-hand side, you have a key. That key helps you interpret that data, what each data means. So for here, we have a big blue wedge of that pie that represents 55% of pet ownership. So of the people surveyed, or of the numbers counted, 55% of these people own dogs. 30% own cats. So we're talking about part of a whole. So of all the people we talk to about what pets they own, this is how we can break down those numbers. Another kind of graph that we can use is what is called a bar graph. Bar graphs use bars, hence the name, of different lengths and heights to represent your data. You're going to graph out a bar graph on a set of axes. So you have your x and y axis. Your x-axis goes horizontally, your y-axis goes vertically. And the numbers being expressed here are going to show different quantities that are not specifically related to each other. So each bar is an independent set of data. So what we represent in one bar doesn't necessarily have to be connected to what is represented in the next bar. And like any chart or graph, we want to have a key that helps us interpret what that data is actually telling us. So here's an example of a bar graph. And this one, the bars are represented horizontally, so they're going left to right rather than up and down. Again, we have a title at the top, number of households in the U.S. owning pets. Okay, so this tells us right away what this information is. Without that title, all you have is a list of numbers and a list of animals. Okay, that could be anything. That could be the number of animals in a zoo. Okay. Now notice at the bottom of the x-axis, that's the horizontal, we have the numbers 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, but below that we have a label to that axis. So whenever you have an x and y axis, you want to include labels for these axes as well. So we know what those numbers and what that data means. Okay, so here we're talking about millions of households. So where you have the number 10, that's representing 10 million homes in the US, and then we can use that to figure out, well, how many people have these kinds of pets. Okay. There should be a label on the y-axis as well, okay, where you see small animals, reptiles, fish. Okay, we don't have a label there, so that would be a little bit more confusing. Here's another bar graph, this one representing the data vertically rather than horizontally. And another good thing that bar graphs can be used for is for comparing sets of data. So here we have a purple bar and a kind of a pinkish bar, I guess. Okay, so you have vacation package A and vacation package B. So the title tells us this is summer vacation packages sold. So we can imagine this is some sort of like travel agency, and they're charting where people are going and what packages we are selling for those vacations. So if you look at the first one, you have Calgary. You have the purple bar representing how many people got vacation package A, and the pink bar, vacation package B. So we can put those bars side by side to compare those different values. And then each set of bars is representing a different data point. So what you'd want to use a bar graph when you can say the data in one bar is separate from the data of the other bar. So the number of people that go to Calgary versus the number of people that go to Montreal are independent. Okay. Yes, you could have someone take two different vacations, but whether or not someone goes to Calgary is independent to whether or not someone goes to Montreal. These are all in Canada, if you didn't know. Okay. Next kind of graph, which is, again, something that you're probably familiar with, is a line graph. A common mistake I see among students is I'll see people use a bar graph when they should use a line graph, or use a line graph when they should use a bar graph. Okay. These two types of graphs are not always interchangeable. Some data we can graph in multiple graphs. So like the previous example of the household pets, you could possibly put that into a circle chart, a circle graph. Okay. But it would not be appropriate to put the household pet data in a line graph. Okay. Line graphs are used to show relationships between your data points. Okay. So a very common use of a line graph is to show how the data changes over time. We're going to plot time on one axis and then our values, our measurements on another axis, because time is connected. Okay. What's going on now is connected to what it was going on 5 minutes ago and what will be going on 5 minutes from now. Okay. So time is one long connected line. Okay, so the data we're collecting over time represent connected data points. So here's an example of a line graph. And again, we can graph out multiple sets of data, and we can see that from the key that we have to the right. Okay. Now, what's missing off of this graph? A title. Okay, so we're missing a title. So what this graph is explaining is not explicitly clear. Now, we can figure it out based on what's given to us. We have the months going across the bottom, so January, February, March, April, May, and then on the side it says savings. USD stands for United States dollars, so how much money you're saving. So we can interpret that this graph is telling us something about the saving patterns of Jack and Barbara, whoever these people are. But if we put a title, it would be much more obvious and much more clear what this graph is trying to tell us. Now, what's important to interpret here is that we use a line graph because how much money Jack, for example, has in January is connected to how much money they have in February and how much money they have in March. Okay, so think about it. If I'm looking at my checking account or my savings account and I say, okay, in February I had $2,000, okay, you can look back. January is connected to that. The reason why I have $2,000 in February is because I had $1,000 to start with in January. The reason why I have $2,500 in March is because I had $2,000 to start with in February. So that data is connected. Okay? Of course, this is over time. Okay? Now, what's really evident from line graphs especially is the patterns. So if you look at Jack's pattern, what's going on? Well, he has money in January, then he has more money in February, then more in March, and more in April, and then in May his money goes down. Okay, so this kind of shows us a pattern of what's going on with Jack. Jack is saving money. Maybe he's saving money for a vacation in May. So he put his money away, and then on May he actually spent his money. Okay, Barbara, on the other hand, has a different pattern. Okay, she has money in the bank account, then that money goes down, and then the money goes up, and then money goes down, and then money goes up. Okay, so maybe she's saving money, then spending money, saving money, and spending money. Or, as with many people, she gets a paycheck, and then she spends that paycheck, and then she doesn't have any money. And then she gets another paycheck, so now she has money again. Okay, so her bank account is going up and down because of money coming in and money going out. Okay, but by looking at this graph, those patterns become much more readily apparent than if you were looking at some sort of data table. Once we have our data organized, we can now start to ask ourselves, well, what is this data telling us? What does it mean? And we can start to analyze. Analyzing data is basically where we start to pull meaning from that data. Okay. Now, some of that meaning can relate back to your hypothesis. Does it support my hypothesis? Does it refute my hypothesis? But also, another way that we can analyze data is we can use that data to find patterns and follow those patterns to places our experiment didn't go. Okay. So what I mean by that is if you're, say, tracking your savings, as in the last graph, okay, that graph went from January to May. Well, after May is June. Okay, so what happened in June? Well, we don't know specifically because we didn't graph that data. Maybe we didn't measure in June. But we can use the patterns that we saw in that graph to guess at what happened in June for Jack and Barbara. Okay. So this is another useful thing that graphs can do for us, is that they can help us interpret the data and ask ourselves, well, what's going to happen next? Okay. And there's a couple different things that we can do with data in this fashion, and these are relevant because this is often what's asked of you on like the EOC, or if you take a more advanced scientist like an AP science class, they're going to ask you to make predictions and make inferences. Okay. And also to draw conclusions. Okay. So a lot of times people look at these words, prediction, inference, and say, oh, well, these are the same things. But scientifically, they mean specific kind of interpretations. So a prediction is where you are going to make a statement of what is likely to happen based on what has already happened. Okay. So in the example earlier of the squirrel running up to the tree, taking an acorn, and then running away, okay, you can predict that the squirrel is going to do that again because you've seen it happen before. Okay, this event has already happened, so we can predict that it's going to happen again. Okay. Scientifically speaking, scientists don't just predict just off the top of their head. They usually make predictions based on data. Okay, so if I have a set of data, especially if I can graph that data, I can use that data to predict the measurements that might occur next. Okay? And there's two basic ways to make predictions numerically. This is what we call extrapolation and interpolation. So extrapolation is where we are basically predicting data beyond the measurements that we've taken. Okay, look at the word extrapolation. The first part of that is extra. So you're trying to predict extra data that we didn't measure. So if I do an experiment for a year, okay, I can predict, I can extrapolate what's going to happen next year. Even though I didn't continue the experiment, I can use the data that I have and say, okay, this is the pattern that I was following. So if I assume that the pattern holds true, then I can predict what's going to happen next. Okay. So in this example right here, we have the value of Sarah's car. If you know anything about cars, you know that the moment you buy a car and drive it off the dealership lot, okay, it immediately starts depreciating in value, meaning it's worth less than what you bought it for. So if I buy a car and then a year later try to sell that same car back to the car dealer, they're going to give me less money than what I paid for it because the car is just not worth as much because it's a year old and I've been driving it around, so it depreciates in value. So this chart is graphing out the value of Sarah's car. So let's imagine that every year she takes her car into the car dealer and says, how much would you give me for my car now? So in 2001, at the beginning of this graph, let's assume she buys the car for $24,000. She goes back in 2002, says, how much is my car worth? And they say, okay, after being driven for a year, it's worth $22,500. So it's gone down in value. And then a year later, 2003, it's now worth $19,700. Then a year later, $17,500. So as the years go on, her car continues to depreciate. The value goes down, 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 down. Okay. Now, last time she took a car into the dealer was 2007. If we wanted to predict how much the car was worth in 2008, we can extrapolate that information despite the fact that we don't have an actual measurement. Okay? If we look at that graph, the line is going down at a specific curve. Okay? So if we were to take a ruler and extend that line beyond 2007, we can make a reasonable prediction. We can extrapolate what the value of that car would be. And if we were to extend the line down, it would intersect to at around $1,600. Okay. So even though we didn't measure that, we can predict it. We can extrapolate it. We can go beyond the measured data. Now, another way we can go about doing this is we can interpolate the data. Okay. And again, kind of like extrapolate is extra. Interpolate is when we're in the middle of our data. So every year, let's say on January, Sarah takes her car in to figure out how much it's worth. Okay, what if we wanted to know how much the car was worth in July? Okay, well, we didn't measure that in July, but we do have the measurements from one January to the next. So let's say the midpoint of 2005. So in 2005, January 2005, her car was worth $14,500. In January of 2006, it was worth $10,000. So we know the value of her car is somewhere between $10,000 and $14,500 in the middle. Okay, so if we follow that line, we can actually make an interpolation. We can basically predict what that value would have been if we went in and got it evaluated in July based on that connecting point, those lines in between. So if we were to actually do that, it would line up with kind of halfway between the 10,000 and the 15,000 mark. So that would be about $12,250. Okay. This is interpolation of the data. We're basically saying, okay, between our data points. And this is useful for a scientist because in some cases it's not practical to measure all the time. Like if I'm doing an experiment that runs for 60 minutes, it's not necessarily practical to take a measurement every second of that 60 minutes. So I can take a measurement every minute or every 5 minutes and then interpolate where that data would have fallen at 2 minutes and 34 seconds. Okay? So I don't necessarily have to take a measurement every second to be able to know where the measurements were during that time frame. The final thing to think about, or the final way we can kind of analyze data, is what we call an inference. Now, a lot of people kind of mix up predictions and inferences and assume that they're kind of the same thing. Really, the difference between a prediction and an inference is the presence of quantitative data. Scientifically speaking, a prediction is based off of numerical data where we can calculate what's going to happen next. An inference is basically guessing at what's going to happen next just based on prior experience or prior knowledge. So you don't necessarily have any data present to tell you what's going to happen next, but you can kind of guess at what's going to happen next based on what you've already been through. So if you've ever been sitting inside the movie theater watching a scary movie, this is a movie you've never seen before. All of a sudden, there's a scary noise from somewhere in the house, and someone says, "I'll check out in the basement." Well, what's going to happen next? Well, the guy that goes in the basement is going to die, okay? Because every scary movie, people die when there's scary noises in the basement. Okay, so you can infer that if someone goes into a dark, scary basement, something bad is going to happen. And this is why sometimes people are scared to go into their own basements, because I've seen that happen so many times in the movies. I can infer if I go into a dark, scary basement, that's going to happen to me. Now, is it likely going to happen to you in real life? Probably not. Probably the worst thing is you'll come across some cockroaches or something. But because you have some prior experience, and it doesn't even have to be your experience to be able to make inferences. You can be aware of experience, have knowledge of something, and be able to infer from it. Okay? So the example that we have here, you walk into a room, the lights are off, and there's a cake with lit candles on the table. What do you infer? It's a surprise party. It's a birthday party. Even if you've never had a surprise party yourself, okay, you've probably seen enough TVs, shows, movies where they've done surprise parties that you kind of have an idea what is going on. And even if you didn't realize it was a surprise party because the lights were turned off, most of us are familiar with what birthday cakes are. Okay, even if you've never had a birthday cake yourself, we've seen pictures of them. Okay, people have talked about, okay, this is what my birthday cake was like. It was a cake with candles on it. So we have enough knowledge of this idea, enough experience with this idea, where you don't have to know what happens next to kind of infer, okay, this is what's going on. Now, there are some times when we kind of subvert our expectations. So, darkened room, birthday candles, you walk in, someone says, "Surprise! It's time to take the SATs." Okay, that would be weird. Okay, why would you have a birthday cake if I'm going to take a test? But the logical inference is what would follow that scenario. And in fact, scientists have actually studied humor, okay, what makes people laugh, and they find whenever you can make an inference, but then defy that inference. Okay, if someone's walking along and there's a banana peel on the sidewalk, okay, you can infer from previous experience, knowledge of the scenario. Okay, someone's going to step on that banana peel and they're going to slip and fall. Okay, but someone's walking along and then all of a sudden they get tackled by a football player. Well, yeah, that was totally unexpected. A lot of research has gone into saying that humor is what is when you cannot infer what's going to happen next. It's something totally unexpected. Okay? In science, scientists like patterns because they can expect what happens next. Science gets really exciting when those unexpected things happen. And we say, wait a minute, that's not what we could infer, that's not what we could predict was going to happen next. And when it comes down to inferences, we always need to kind of double check how we infer. Okay, how do we know what's going to happen? How do we know that we're correct about our inferences? And sometimes it just has to be, we got to let the pattern play out. Okay, we see the darkened room, the birthday cake. We got to wait until people jump out and say, "Surprise, happy birthday," and then that confirms your inference.